The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 48. Opium. My mum began travelling with me my third year with British Airways. This was one of the perks of the job that almost every crew member took advantage of. The tickets cost us next to nothing, and a pact existed between all crew members that every accompanying family member would be upgraded to first class, or at the very least to business, when there were seats available. We also received generous discounts on hotel rates worldwide, but mostly the accompanying family member would share the room that the airline had already reserved for its crew member. When my mum travelled with me, I began to experience moments of happiness and sometimes inner peace that coincided with intermittent stretches of gratitude and relief that things could be infinitely so much worse. I still suffered with barrages of negative thinking, and sometimes my thoughts ate me until I was just a snarling internal mess. But there were also times, especially lying on beaches or riding horseback or in casinos, that I did not feel like the devil himself was living in my head. I had once asked Auntie Joan about the devil, and all she had said on the matter was, "Be vigilant, duck, he shows up in mysterious ways." I got to see Auntie Joan every 6 weeks or so. I would drive down the M3 to Somerset with orchids for her and tobacco for Uncle Jim. Every time I pulled up to Dodonall's, I smiled because nothing had changed in over 10 years. The crows looked the same, and so did every blade of grass. Uncle Jim looked the same too, in his armchair, sucking fervidly on his pipe as if it was a pacifier. Perhaps it was. He always pretended to be happy to see me, and maybe he genuinely was, but he had accepted that Auntie Joan and I had an inseparable bond, and his general inclination towards unresponsiveness allowed us to commune with each other while he remained in the background. "You can't get blood out of a stone" is the proverb that must have been penned by someone who knew Uncle Jim very well. My mother had recently started working for a company as a saleswoman that sold custom kitchens, and she was very good at it, converting most loose leads to sales. Her boss loved her because his commission grew as hers did. Her hours were flexible, and she set all her own appointments. During the second week with the company, my mum won a holiday for 2 to Ibiza and gave it away to a co-worker who loved Spain. My mum was now travelling to much more exotic destinations, cheaply and in style with me. It was the first time since I could remember that my mother didn't have a husband or a boyfriend or a work schedule that was binding. I suspected she was looking for a husband, however, perhaps a handsome pilot or a first-class passenger with wads of money. She liked Sagittarians. But for now she was paying attention to me, and I was happy she was back, thrilled actually, and so was she. We became instant best friends, although in many ways we always had been. But back then, life was too challenging for either of us to notice the underlying truth of our relationship. During one of our trips to South Africa, my mum and I were drinking wine on the balcony and waiting for room service to bring us our supper. The sun was setting, the sky the usual melange of reds and oranges and pinks that made African sunsets the most dramatic. My mum looked flushed as the sun set, but not in a vibrant way. She looked sunburned and sad and preoccupied. She then began to recount the abandonment of her childhood in a way that I hadn't heard before. "It was bad," my mum said in her voice that sounded like a 9-year-old girl's. "She told me and my sister that she loved us very much, but she would never see us again. We had been dressed for bed, and when we woke up she was gone. She didn't lie. I never saw her again, Sarah." I felt my mum wanted to justify herself to me, and perhaps she was even seeking my compassion, or maybe she just wanted to enlighten me as to the source of her weaknesses. It worked because the pain my mum still felt coursed through me. I smiled the smile of irony when I realised it was because I could relate to her. My mum went on to tell me that although my granddad was decrepit now, back then he had been intimidating and was prone to anger and sometimes to violence without provocation. His roving eye had also contributed to my grandmother's decision to flee. "Why didn't she take you with her?" I demanded as sweetly as I could. "Your grandfather would never have allowed that, Sarah. Men had so much more authority than women back then, and she was scared of him. I expect the only reason my mother was able to cope with the loss was to pretend that my sister and I didn't exist." "Why didn't you break the cycle?" That was the inevitable question I didn't ask. But the still small voice had the answer, and what it said made me laugh. "Wounded people do fucked up things, Sarah, but your mum loves you more than you could possibly know." After that, I still harboured anger towards my mother, but not so often. I was softer and more understanding. She had been 9, just a little girl, when she had been abandoned. I had been 14, and so much more savvy, more inclined to understand the shortcomings of humans generally. Things must have been so much more difficult for her. My mother and I often reminisced too. We had been through a lot together and had seen a lot of life's ugliness. My mother understood me because little about me was a mystery to her. Most people didn't have a clue who I was. But I was my mother's daughter, and we shared similar perceptions about a lot of things, and often reached parallel conclusions with our observations about life and people and the situations we encountered. My mother was also accepting of my mood changes, which was still a problem. She knew that I still suffered emotionally, and always made an effort to be patient with me, allowing me to come out of my tantrums at my own pace. If I got angry with her, brought up the past, or was critical or cynical, she didn't overreact. She was skillful at diffusing tension and didn't continue a negative cycle out of pride. Sporadically, the pain of old resentments compelled me to say nasty things, but my mother accepted that it would pass and waited patiently for me to come back down. But the single most uniting factor that allowed us to experience our travels in a childlike and exuberant way was the fact that we shared a similar, if not identical, sense of humour. We both loved irony and sarcasm, as well as the absurd and the unexpected. On one trip to the Seychelles, I bought my mother a bottle of her favourite perfume, opium. After that, this was the only scent she ever wore. I felt it was a declaration of faithfulness. She would dab it on the back of her neck every morning, and when the bottle ran out, I would buy her another. The spicy smell evoked a strange reaction in me. I felt that it should have been created exclusively for her, and when I smelled it on someone else, it annoyed me. If a passenger asked to buy it from the duty-free bar, I always told them we had sold out. The exotic scent made me feel a longing for another time and another place, somewhere lost, somewhere mysterious. The Far East, perhaps. A place I had felt I had spent a whole lifetime when, of course, I'd only been there for just a few days at a time. My mother travelled in first class most of the time and received the same attention as those who had paid thousands for their ticket. She was served Dom Perignon on takeoff, alongside canopies topped with smoked salmon and capers. Not that she liked either, but she pretended to. I once spied on her from the galley and saw her spit caviar into a napkin. When she saw me watching, we both laughed hysterically. I loved the fact that my mum was treated like a queen. Of all the people I'd ever known, she deserved it. We stayed in luxury hotels and had plenty of cash to spend, yen and dinar and rupees, sometimes on crappy shit we couldn't live without, but sometimes on rugs and brass artefacts. We bathed in tropical waters, holding a cocktail in one hand and a cigarette in the other. We saw enormous whales arc through the air as we sailed the Pacific. We skied in the clear waters surrounding Mauritius, and back at the hotel we had massages and facials and room service. We would often lie in bed and order movies, and later, after a nap, we would play cribbage at the pool while watching the sunset over some new horizon. We went from yacht club to country club. We walked along Fifth Avenue one week and rode former racehorses around the Kyalami racetrack the next. We parted with transvestites at the Rome Club in Bangkok, who were often more beautiful than the most beautiful women I'd ever seen, although, maybe not, the Laker ladies.